On October 30th, 1982, Russell Gray drove out to Camden, New Jersey to stay with an old friend before traveling to a work meeting in the city. During the early hours of the morning, he witnessed something that at the time seemed too strange to be real. It was something so unsettling he couldn't shift it from his thoughts. What Russell witnessed was no mere coincidence or his imagination, but a frightful vision of what was to come. These deja vu moments happen for a reason, and for Russell it was a moment that later linked in with 6 people plummeting to their horrific deaths. I grew up in Camden, New Jersey, so back then it was normal for me to visit New York often. When I was younger, the excitement of the city seemed to lure me in, but as a quiet man in his mid-30s, I found myself no longer caring for such things. I now lived in the Pennsylvania countryside, and I embraced the quiet. The only time I ventured into the city was for work. When my boss told me about a work convention I had to attend on Halloween in Manhattan, I felt uneasy. The city was hectic enough without having to deal with people dressed in scary masks and running around the streets in the daytime. And I know what my friends always said. Halloween? It's the only time the real freaks don't need masks to fit in. Feeling anxious about it, I contacted an old school friend, Todd Bennett, who still lived in New Jersey with his wife, Katie, and I asked if I could stay with him and his wife for a couple of nights. It beat staying in the bustle of New York, but it was close enough to travel there and back the following day. I showed up at Todd's house that evening with a Pothos houseplant for him I'd bought from the gas station. He lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, and my first thoughts were, well, that's as creepy as it is impressive. It looked like one of the houses from a horror movie. You know, the kinds where there ends up being something freaky hiding in the basement or something. I put my uncertainty aside and I made sure I was smiling as I knocked on the door. Spooky old house or not, it was great to see Todd, and I was grateful for his hospitality. He seemed stoked to see me and he showed me around the house. The paint was peeling in more places than not, and there were cracks and wear and tear, but they informed me that it was a work in progress. I tried to be upbeat and positive, but it was a 7-hour drive from Pennsylvania and I was tired, so after dinner I talked to them for about an hour before I politely made my excuses to go to bed. Todd showed me to my room, which was on the first floor and overlooked the long driveway at the front of the house. We engaged in a short conversation, and then, on seeing me yawn, he made a joke about how he would stop boring me, and then he said goodnight and left. As I changed into my pajamas and I paced around the room, I did what I always do when I've been in social situations, and I overthought the smallest of details. What if Todd and Katie thought I was too quiet, or too forced, or too awkward and rude for showing up with a cheap, half-dead plan? I got into bed, reminding myself that I had to be up early to travel in the city, so I didn't have time for self-sabotage. It was fine. They liked me, and it was nice to see them. As I closed my eyes, I told myself to get some sleep. I should have known it wouldn't be that easy. The old house seemed to creak with each flinch and thought. Then, when I finally felt like I was drifting off, I saw bright lights through the thin curtains and I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. I checked the time on my digital alarm clock that I brought with me and placed on my nightstand. 3:03. Who was showing up at Todd and Katie's at this hour? I was going to ignore them, but then a thought crossed my mind. What if it was burglars? I needed to at least peek through the window and check to put my mind at rest. I got out of bed and I walked over to the window, walking slowly so I caused the minimal amount of floorboard creaks. I pulled back the side of the curtain and I looked down at the driveway, which was lit up by the glow of the crescent moon, as well as the visitors' headlights. I stared at what I was seeing in disbelief. There, parked on the driveway, was a black hearse with silver-trimmed windows. I couldn't see if there was a coffin in the back, but I saw white flowers resting on top of something. A wreath of white against the nighttime backdrop. A man in a long black coat, black gloves, and a black fedora hat was standing in front of the open passenger door, his appearance there emphasized by the glow of the moon. I twitched the curtain, making sure that this was real, but the hearse didn't vanish. Instead, more people appeared. A whole line of them, all of them in black formal wear. I counted them, 7 people including the man in black. A woman at the front of the line had hair almost as soft in shade as the moon. I watched as one by one they got into the back of the hearse. It shouldn't have been big enough for all of them, yet they disappeared inside with ease. It would have been comical if it wasn't so confusing. I thought I was going mad. I pinched my wrist to confirm this really was happening, and then I placed a trembling hand against the cotton fabric of my pajama shirt to feel my beating heart. I wondered what was going on. Could it be a Halloween prank? But surely it was too early for such a thing. It wasn't even Halloween night yet. When the line of people disappeared, I expected the man in black to shut the door and end this madness, but he didn't. Instead, he stared up at my window and pointed directly at me. Even though I was peeking around the side of the corner, I knew he could see me. It caused chills to run down my spine. I felt this feeling of pure fear and dread, but I didn't know what I was afraid of, not properly. I told myself to ignore him and he'd go away, but the minutes ticked by and he continued to stand there pointing at my window. I thought about knocking on Todd and Katie's room and telling them to see this for themselves. But I couldn't remember where their room was, and I didn't want to disturb them at this time for something so strange. Knocking on random doors was not going to solve this. Little did I know it was far too late. The repercussions had already been set in stone. Deciding I had to sort this out for myself, I pulled the curtain aside and I heaved open the window frame, placing my pale, trembling hands on the window ledge. I looked down at the man in black and through my clenched throat I said, "Excuse me, but what are you doing here?" The man in black continued to point and stare directly at me, as in a quiet voice that seemed to carry in the still air, "There's still room for one more." I furiously shook my head, unable to find the words to tell him no. I was still shaking my head as I shut the window, pulled across the curtain, and stood there, deadly still, as I waited for something, anything, to happen. I don't remember when the headlight beams vanished and darkness returned. I just remember feeling as though something had changed. I was stuck with fear, but I made myself pull back the curtain enough to check if my inkling was right. It was. Both the man in black and the hearse had gone. The soft glow of the moon illuminated the now empty space where they both had just been. Once I calmed down from that weirdness that just happened, I crept back into bed and eventually fell asleep. I awoke the next morning to my buzzing alarm, and I forced my tired body out of bed. At breakfast, I couldn't shake that nagging unease of what had happened last night out of my mind. I stared at my wrist where I'd pinched myself, but as a man prone to flushed complexion, I couldn't point out the exact placement. Todd and Katie noticed my strange behavior and asked me if something was wrong. Before I could stop myself, I blurted out a short version of what had taken place and what the man in black had said to me. I noticed this look of fear fill Katie's eyes, but she didn't say anything. She just forced a smile. But Todd chuckled and said, "Well, it sounds like you had a crazy dream." It didn't feel like a dream, but I just nodded, and I didn't say anything else about it. I thanked them for letting me stay, and I told them I would see them later on, and then I went on my way. I left extra early, but after finding a parking place, getting the bus into 42nd Street Port Authority, and finding the office where my business meeting was being held, I only just made it there with minutes to spare. The elevator was out of order, so I had to take the stairs. I felt so hot and sweaty running up them to be on time that my breathing became frantic, and I had to loosen my tie to feel more comfortable. I still felt so uncomfortable for the entire meeting, but at least I wasn't late. At the time, that seemed the most important thing. If only I'd known then how insignificant this was, in comparison to the horrors that were about to happen. At lunchtime, I was told to go to the ground floor where a buffet was being served. I dreaded the thought of taking those stairs again, but as I headed to the stairwell, I saw that a group of people were standing outside the elevator. My first thoughts were, thank God, the elevator was back in service. But as I walked over to the group of people waiting, I noticed that there, at the front, was a woman with fair, almost silver hair. It took me a moment to place where I'd seen her before, but then it hit me. It was the same woman I had seen last night. She'd been at the front of the hearse line. I heard the ping of the elevator, and I saw the doors slide open, and I watched them pile in. The woman with almost white hair walked in there first. I was frozen with fear. Every inch of my being was screaming at me not to go in that elevator. I felt a firm grip on my shoulder and I flinched. A man dressed in all black moved his hand away and stepped past me and into the elevator. He pointed directly at me in gloved hands and in a quiet voice that seemed to echo around me said, "There's room for one more." I shook my head and I took a step back as I replied, "No, thank you. I will wait for the next one." I stood there frozen and counted the people in there before the door slid shut. There were 7 of them in total, including the man in black, just like there had been last night. I heard the creaking of metal and I remained there, unmoving. The smash was louder than any sound I'd heard before. It ricocheted off the walls and caused me to fall onto the floor with a thud. I heard the screams that followed, but I didn't know where they were coming from. Anywhere and everywhere. I don't remember much of what happened next. I was in a stampede of panicked people being rushed down the stairwell. On the ground floor, I saw the destruction in front of me. The open elevator doors, the sprawled limbs, the splattered blotches of blood. The screams continued and firm hands pushed me outside into the noise and further panic. I could picture the death scene in my mind. I will never not picture that scene. I was standing there, amid the mayhem, avoiding the mix of panicked office workers and people in Halloween masks trying to pass by, and I saw 2 teens filter through, a vampire and a cloaked skeleton. I smelt the cheap plastic of their masks as much as I smelt charred metal. It made me feel sick, and I had to grip onto a nearby car hood to stop my legs from giving way. When I looked up, I saw a man casually stroll out of the building. He was dressed in all black, and he seemed to weave past the crowd of hysterical people without being noticed. I felt a cold chill trickle through my body, and I froze and I looked at him. It was the same man from the hearse in the elevator. He looked at me. He tipped his hat, and then he walked straight past me. I watched him leave until I could no longer see him anymore. I just saw shadows. I'd seen him get into that elevator, yet there he was, without as much as a graze on him. I couldn't make sense of anything. I don't remember going back to my car or driving back to Todd and Katie's. I just remember being back in their kitchen and telling them what had happened. I thought they would think me crazy, but I saw a darkness in Todd's eyes before he chuckled, and he made out it was mere coincidence. I noticed that this time, Katie didn't try to mask her fear behind a forced smile. When Todd left the room, she checked he was out of earshot before whispering into my ear, "It happened to me too, but please, don't mention it to Todd. Talk like this unnerves him." I nodded and I said no more on the matter. The next morning I went back to Pennsylvania, vowing to never stay at a friend's house or step foot in an elevator ever again. a promise made to myself at the time I fully intended to keep. Russell went back to Pennsylvania and immediately quit his job, intent on living a quiet life. Then, in 2017, Katie Bennett contacted him, telling him that Todd had sadly passed away, but that now she felt able to talk about the strange experience that happened to her. Exactly 1 year before Russell came to stay with them, on October 30th, 1981, she had woken at around 3 a.m. to a loud noise coming from outside. She'd gone outside to see a silver-trimmed black hearse, a man in black, and a line of 3 people getting into the back of it, including her cousin, Rosie. Rosie disappeared inside the hearse before Katie could talk to her. She tried asking the man in black why he was there, but he smiled at her and said, "There is room for one more." She refused and went back inside and awoke Todd, but when he looked out of the window, the hearse and people had gone. The following day, Katie felt too unwell to meet Rosie for lunch in town as arranged. That day, her cousin was involved in a collision in which she and 2 other people died. When Katie went to leave flowers at the place where the collision had happened, she saw a man there dressed in black. The same man that had been by the hearse. On hearing Katie's account, Russell finally felt like he wasn't going mad and felt brave enough to finally tell his story. However, he still kept the promise he made to himself and never dared to go back to the house where he was adamant he had seen a vision of death itself. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.